Yes, hello and welcome to the final lecture of the fall series of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology's joint lecture series. As with our previous lectures, you may ask any questions at any time during the lecture in the chat or the Q&A feature. If you would like to ask your question in person after the lecture is over, you may use the raise your hand feature and I can promote you to a panelist, but please know that you will be recorded and we will be able to see you and hear you. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Dr. Sarah Sportman, the Connecticut State Archaeologist, who will be presenting archaeological research at the 17th century Lieutenant John Hollister Site, South Glastonbury, 2016 to 2021. Dr. Sportman, a historical archaeologist and zooarchaeologist, has published her research in regional and national journals. In addition to her duties as state archaeologist, Dr. Sportman serves as a board member of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut and is the editor of the Bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut. Please join me in welcoming her for this talk. And I'm going to mute my.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us tonight for the last in our fall lecture series. I'm really excited to be here tonight to talk about the Hollister site. I know that over the years, many of you have been out to the site to participate in the excavations or just to visit. So I thank you for your continued interest in the project. Before we get started, I just want to say that this project was really the baby of Brian Jones, and he was so excited about the research potential here. And he used the site as a tremendous platform for engaging people in Connecticut archaeology. So, I'm really grateful that we've been able to keep the project going and build on the work that Brian did out at the site to move the project forward and learn more about the early colonial period in Connecticut and keep up that, tradition of engaging volunteers and students and the public in the archaeology at the site. So as we go through the presentation, particularly as I recap the past work, you're probably going to recognize Brian's hand shots of artifacts from the field, which I think is fitting because he's always going to be a part of the Hollister site. And, it's really impossible for us to be out there working, not talking about him and the ideas that he had and some of the research strategies that he was thinking about. So, he continues to be an integral part of the site and the research there. So my plan for tonight is to just provide some background on the project, recap the first several years of fieldwork from 2015 to 2019, hopefully with some new insights, and then talk about what we did in the 2021 field season. Unfortunately, we were not able to go out to the site in 2020 because of COVID, so we did take that year off, but we had a really productive field season this year, and I think we're really learning a lot and getting a good handle on what's going on out there. So without further ado, we're going to launch in here. Okay, sorry about that. So for those of you who are not familiar with the site or need a refresher, the Hollister site is located in South Glastonbury, what is modern day South Glastonbury, right on the Connecticut River. It's the yellow star there in the picture. Just downriver is the oldest continually operating ferry in the US, in operation since 1655. In the 17th century, the land where the Hollister site is located was part of Wethersfield, and it was comprised of large tracts of farm and pasture land that were mostly owned by people who lived in Wethersfield proper. And the long tracts were set out in basically large strips going back 3 miles from the river to give people a mix of different types of land that they would need to make a living. So access to the river, farm and pasture land, timberlands, and that kind of thing. So that's sort of what we're going for here. The history of the site, so just to kind of situate it, it's located on an alluvial terrace along the east bank of the Connecticut River. And it's basically been, with the exception of the Hollister site and the houses that were there, from the 17th through the 20th century, it's been purely for agricultural use. It's been farmland for corn, wheat, apples, potatoes, vegetables, and tobacco over the years. So it's been plowed. And it's mostly served as pasture since 1950, and that's what it is today. And there are horses out at the site in the present day as well. This is a landscape that hosts numerous indigenous sites that are located along this terrace on the river, really kind of reflecting the importance of the river in the pre-contact period for thousands of years, as well as in the historic period. And I'll talk a little bit more about the river as we get through the presentation today. So to give you a little bit of background, this project has a long history with the Office of State Archaeology. When Nick Bellantoni was state archaeologist, they did some testing out at the site, and Brian was actually out there digging test pits with them then. And then when Nick retired and he took over, Brian really launched a serious research investigation of the property. So back in 2015, they started out with remote sensing, doing ground penetrating radar, magnetometry. That's between 2015 and 2016. And that work was done by Peter Leach, who was a grad student at UConn at the time, as well as Maeve Herrick and Jasmine Saxon, who were graduate students at the University of Denver. And the site is actually perfect for remote sensing based on its the soils and the composition. So their results were actually pretty extraordinary. And you can see that in the map here to the side. If you look at the map, you can see there are these dark, mostly rectangular looking features on the map, and those are the core of the site, and they've basically turned out to be cellar features, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the beginning, in a minute, excuse me. So archaeological investigations between 2015 and 2021 have largely focused on the features that were identified through the remote sensing work in 2015 and 2016. And along with the archaeological investigations, Brian started doing documentary research on the site to get a better sense of the history and the historical context, figure out who was out there, what activities they were engaged in, and what was going on at the site to contextualize the materials that they were finding. So, based on Brian's research and research by others from the Glastonbury Historical Society and, descendants, we know that pre-1640, and it's important to, remember this, is that this property was Wangunk land, and it had been native land for thousands of years before that. In 1640, the land was allotted in Wethersfield, and it changed hands a couple of times in the 1640s. Now, John Hollister the first arrived in Wethersfield in 1642 and purchased the property sometime in the 1640s, before 1651. We know from the documents that between 1651 and 1663, the house was leased by the Gilbert family. There's anecdotal evidence, at least, that in 1651, there was already a house and some infrastructure out at the site. So for that 12 years, the farm was operated by a tenant farm family, the Gilberts. And I'll talk more about them in a little while. In 1665, Lieutenant John Hollister died, and he left the house, barn, orchard, pasture, and 60 plus acres in Niag, or where the site is now, which is Glastonbury, to his son John. In 1667, John gets married to Sarah Goodrich, and they live on the farm and for the rest of their lives, basically, with their children. So in the 1690s, the younger John starts to subdivide the farm. In 1693, he gives 2 acres to the Reverend Timothy Stevens. And then in the late 1690s to around 1700, he subdivides to his sons. His wife dies around this time, and he basically lives alone on a small portion of the site until he dies in 1711. And after that, the site is basically abandoned. So from 1711 to the present, it's served as crop and pasture land and is lain undisturbed, all that time, which contributes a great deal to the incredible preservation that we have out there. So just to kind of get you situated, this map shows, go back for a second. This map that I was just showing shows the core here, where you have the north, middle, and south cellars, and here's a well. And this is the area that the initial investigations kind of focused on. So this map shows the previous excavations between 2015 and 2017. So 2015 are the blue squares. Those were 1 meter units that were excavated basically down to the base of the plow zone around the middle cellar, basically to ground truth the GPR and see if, what they thought they were picking up really was a cellar. That panned out. So in 2016, they came back, and Brian wanted to get a sense of what was going on in these cellars try to date them, try to figure out how they were built, try to figure out the relationship to one another. So that year he put trenches that were 3 meters by 1 meter, and those are the red excavation units in each of the 3 cellars, kind of crossing a wall to get a sense of that architecture, as well as get a good sample of the cellar fill. They also put 1 excavation unit here in this little tiny cellar that is probably associated with a south cellar here. And that resulted in massive amounts of artifacts. The cellars were just chock full of materials, and it created a tremendous amount of lab work, but also provided a great deal of information. So in 2017, they came back to the site, and at this point, they were trying to really figure out the relationship between these structures. The way they're aligned and configured, it really kind of looks like they might be related, and long, narrow houses had been found in the early historic period in Connecticut before. It's typical of some structures that were made in England in the 1500s and 1600s. So there was a question of maybe whether or not these cellars were actually part of one giant structure that had earth-fast portions and portions that were over cellars. So the excavations in the middle that you see in the green were down to the plow zone and geared towards identifying features like posts and sills and things like that that might be related to a long house structure. They did find a number of posts. They found posts that were clearly related to a 20th century tobacco barn, as well as posts that dated to an earlier period. They also found storage pits and other types of features as well. And only a few of those features were explored. A lot of them were covered over for future research. They also put 1 unit over here in the east cellar, which is this little green one that you can see down in the corner. So before I get into the historic materials and the historic portions of the site, we want to acknowledge the fact that, pre-contact Native American materials are found across the site. And as I said, this terrace along the Connecticut River has sites all along and up and down the river. And the Hollister property is no different. So, there's lithic materials found across the site in the plow zone. It's integrated into all of the features mixed up in the cellar fill and things like that. As of 2019, over 2,140 lithic artifacts had been found, including 21 projectile points. Most of those were from the late Archaic Laurentian and narrow stem traditions. And there's some terminal Archaic material as well. We have 1 soapstone or steatite fragment from the plow zone. And there's also this feature from 2019 that looks very much like a terminal Archaic Native American roasting platform filled with firecrack rock and charcoal. We tested this feature in 2021. There's no artifacts in it, so the jury's still out on whether or not it is historic or pre-contact, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later when we get to that part of the talk. So the 2016 excavations in the cellars focused on 3 cellars: the north cellar, the middle cellar, and the south cellar. And those are those 3 cellars around the core in the middle of the site. So the middle and north cellars, as you can see, are stone lined. They have stone foundations. The south cellar is not. The south cellar, based on the results of the excavation, had plank lined walls, and they found this post in the corner of one of the excavation units, and the way it's situated up against the cellar wall kind of suggests that there are probably posts, several of them set in the cellar floor, to maybe brace those planks and hold them in place, sort of like a retaining wall for the cellar. So this is the post from 2016. Talk a little bit about these cellars. The south and middle cellars are probably the best understood features at the site to date. Back in 2016, Brian got together a whole bunch of researchers, grad students, people who specialized in different things, botanical analysis, phytoliths, faunal. People looked at the pipes and the ceramics and things like that. So he really hit this material hard with a lot of research that year. So it's probably the best studied part of the site to date. The south and middle cellars are very similar in terms of the material that came out of their fill. And, when we talk about these features, it's really important to recognize that the materials that we're looking at here, that we're excavating out of these cellars, these are materials that were deposited in those cellars after they were no longer in use. So, these structures were out of use by the time this material is going in. And it suggests that people are living on the site and basically throwing their trash and other materials in there to fill up these cellars. So they're not just big gaping holes on the property. So the ceramics in both of these cellars are dominated by red earthenwares. And that's typical of the 17th century. I put up this picture of this red earthenware bowl that's been cross-mended from 6 sherds. This is a really important artifact because pieces of this bowl came from both the south and middle cellars. So we know that at least some of that fill was contemporaneous going into those cellars at about the same time. The ceramics in these cellars also include borderwares, as well as a lot of tin glazed ware, Delftware, Maholica. We have tin glazed wares from England, the Netherlands, and Portugal at least. And we're trying to get a better handle on some of the ceramic types. That's one of the goals we have for this winter, is to try to get solid identifications on some of the borderwares and other coarse earthenwares. English and Dutch materials at this time period are kind of tough to tell apart. We really need to go someplace where there are collections that we can look at, such as Plymouth and hopefully Albany, to get a better handle on that material, and to figure out some of the other patterns of Delftware and Maholica that we have, so we can get a better sense of the chronology. There's also Rhenish stonewares, and there's this North Italian marbled slipware over here. You can see with the swirly pattern. That's a ceramic that is primarily produced pre-1650. It turns up at a lot of early 17th century sites, but it also apparently is a ceramic that Dutch traders traded very widely in the 17th century. So, its presence is interesting. You can't say one way or another where we got it from, but it certainly has kind of an early date to it. The middle cellar also produced a Charles I farthing that was minted between 1639 and 1643. It's this little coin fragment down at the bottom. We found a crushed brass kettle. So, all of this taken together really kind of has an early feel to it, like, pre-1660s maybe. But another important aspect of this cellar and the material recovered from it is that what we don't have, and what we don't have out of these cellars, at least the units that were excavated to date, are any materials that clearly date to the last quarter of the 17th century, right? We know the site was occupied until 1711, but we're not really seeing any of the materials that date from the period of like 1670 to 1700 in this cellar fill. So, there's a couple of pieces of English slipware, and other kind of later materials in the plow zone up above these cellars. But when you get down into the cellar fill, like below 50 centimeters, there's nothing that you could conclusively say dates to the last part of the 17th century. So our sense is that these were filled kind of in the middle of that occupation and tend to be among the earlier structures out there. So the south and middle cellars are also interesting for the evidence of trade and interaction with indigenous people. Going into this project from the historical background research, it was known that the Hollisters had relationships with local native people. In particular, there's this situation that's recorded in the colonial documents from 1675, from around the time of King Philip's War, where Lieutenant Hollister provides land for the Wangungs to build a fortified village to basically protect themselves, with the idea that war is on the horizon, it's coming quickly. It says that Hollister had fortified his own house the year before, so that's an interesting little tidbit. And it also specified that the Indians and the English were working side by side to protect their food supplies and to create safety. So that's sort of a thing that was known. I'm going to talk a little bit more about interactions with Native people later on in the talk, but going forward, there's a clear reflection of Native interaction in the form of trade beads and 17th century Native American ceramics. So this is Native American ceramics that are made in the 17th century. They are mixed in the cellars with all kinds of other household debris, ceramics, food remains, whatever. They are clearly materials that were being used by the residents of the site. They're not from an earlier pre-contact occupation that got mixed in there. They're contemporaneous with the English occupation. Another really interesting aspect of the South and Middle Cellars is their faunal assemblages. I first got involved with this project back in 2016. I went out to dig for a couple of days, and Brian asked me to look at the animal bones from the site as part of his big push to get research done on a lot of different classes of the material culture. So most of the ones I looked at were from the South and Middle Cellars. They had incredibly rich assemblages of faunal remains, botanical remains as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. The preservation was incredible: tiny fish bones, tiny rodent bones, shellfish, all manner of small animals. But the material is really intriguing for an English site because, and this is the data as of 2019. I've continued to go through it and add more to it, but I haven't had a chance to do the math and graph it out. Qualitatively, I will say the patterns have not really changed. I continue to see primarily wild species in what I've been going through. But we know from the documents that both the Hollisters and the Gilberts had significant numbers of domesticated animals out at the site, but you would not know it if you looked at the faunal assemblages from the South and Middle Cellar. Okay, they're dominated by wild foods. You can see here circled in red: horse, cow, pig, and sheep, goat. So they're there, but in relatively small numbers. White-tailed deer completely dominate the faunal assemblage, and you have this really interesting array of different species: black bear, raccoon, woodchuck, muskrat, weasel family, skunk, all kinds of birds, 3 different kinds of turtles. You've got fish, and the shellfish aren't even on here. So it's a really diverse faunal assemblage. And it's really intriguing because, in terms of a profile of food at a site, this is far more similar to late woodland contact period Native American assemblages than it is to early colonial English assemblages. So I think that's really intriguing, and it begs a lot of questions about, economic strategies and cultural preferences and things that are going on out there at the site. Haven't really looked at the faunal materials from the other cellars. Some of them didn't have a lot of preservation, but going off what we have in the database, Cellar 5, which I'll talk about later, does seem to have a fair amount, and it also seems to have a pretty strong signature for wild species. So, so far that pattern seems to be holding. It's not to say we won't find a big dump of domesticated animal bones at some point, but so far it hasn't happened. So the botanical data from the South and Middle Cellars include a mix of wild and domesticated plants, New World and Old. Maize and beans and hickory nuts dominate the assemblage. Those are all obviously North American plants. We also have wheat and peas, and grapes and things like that. But, this is less of a anomalous pattern than the animal remains because maize and beans grow very well here. It took a lot longer for wheat and peas and things like that to get up and running for the crops. And maize quickly became important, and as did beans to colonial English people. So I don't think that this signature is terribly anomalous, but it does showcase the diversity of food remains at the site. So the North Cellar, which is the third of that cluster of 3, the other stone line one, is a little bit different. There was a lot of stone rubble in the fill, suggesting that the cellar wall itself kind of got knocked in a bit and was used to partially fill the cellar. There's a much lighter artifact density in the cellar than in the South and Middle Cellars, but in general, the materials were similar overall. It's a similar range of ceramics. We had the red wares, the tin glazed wares, a few pieces of borderware, but there was no indigenous pottery found in this cellar. That was restricted to the South and Middle Cellars so far. There was little faunal or botanical data from this one. And so it's really hard to get a sense of it. It's possible that it's contemporary or was filled at the same time as the other 2, or it might be slightly later, but the jury's still out on that one. We don't really have a good handle on it. And it's possible that a larger artifact assemblage could help to clear that up at some point in the future. So the next year in 2017, after that big push to do the cellars in 2016, The excavations focused in a few different areas. As I said before, there was a focus on trying to figure out what was going on between those cellars, looking for features at the base of the plow zone, trying to see if there were posts or sills that might connect the houses. But they also went and tested some of the areas down in the southern part of the site where there were also GPR anomalies. So they put 2 units in a structure that has come to be known as Cellar 5. This one appeared to be stone lined. The ceramics from this structure included redware and tin glazed wares, which dominate like they did in the others, but there's also some older materials or younger materials in here. There was a couple of pieces of slipware in the cellar, which is more last quarter of the 17th century. And there were a few other artifacts like this pipe down at the bottom, this Huntress and Crusader pipe that's probably Dutch. And those date from 1670 to 1700, kind of pushing it to that last quarter. This cellar did contain lots of bird, fish, mammal bone, and eggshell. So that'll be a good addition to the faunal analysis to get a better handle on the food remains out there. The next year, in 2018, they went back out and investigated what looked like possible circular features in the remote sensing data. And those were just kind of south and southeast of Cellar 5 in the southern part of the site. So they opened up an area, tried to take it down to the base of the plow zone, expecting to find kind of ovoid or circular features because that's how they looked in the remote sensing data. But when they got down, they had another square, another cellar. And this one also appears to be unlined and probably has earth-fast construction. It's a little bit hard to see in the photo from up above, but there are some definite posts around the edge of the structure. Most of those were not investigated. They were covered over with landscape fabric and reburied for future investigation, but it suggested that there was probably an earth-fast structure down there. So, whoops, sorry about that. Getting ahead of myself. The recovered artifacts from this cellar also suggest it was filled probably in or after the last quarter of the 17th century. There were, excuse me, a couple of pipes with maker's marks that date to the last part of the last quarter of the 17th century. Llewellyn Evans pipes, well, those are like 1661 to 1688. Philip Edwards pipes, 1650 to 1702. There's also this tin glazed ceramic right here that you see in the picture with the Chinese scholar sitting under the tree. That pattern is 1675 to 1695, and that was well down in the cellar fill. So that kind of suggests that, you know, a later date of filling for this structure. It doesn't necessarily suggest a later date of construction for it, however, you know, because that earth-fast construction is really kind of intriguing in terms of a possible earlier structure, much like the South Cellar. Another really interesting artifact from the vicinity of this is this coin you can see down at the bottom. It wasn't found from the cellar fill, but from the plow zone up above. And that coin has Arabic writing on it. It was minted in 1692 in Yemen. And that's a whole nother story. It's been associated with, you know, pirate activity in the Indian Ocean in the 1690s. So another really intriguing artifact from the site, but also with a pretty late date. So in 2019, that was the summer that Brian passed away in July. And to keep the project going, Nick Bellantoni, who had stepped in as interim state archaeologist, and Scott Brady went out with volunteers. And there was a lot of interest in being out there that year and keeping the project going to do the excavations that Brian had planned. So the goal was to excavate the area in between Cellars 5 and Cellar 6 down on the southern part of the site, again, to look for features that might help understand the relationship between them. So this is the excavation block from that year. Cellar 5 is up here. This is the corner of Cellar 6 down here. The excavated part is to the south of this. So excavated this block here and found 3 sizable features. Feature 36 is a cluster of rubble and fire-cracked rock. Feature 34 is looked to be like a large pit feature. It was nicknamed the Deer Feast back in 2019 because there were a lot of deer bones sticking right out of the top of it, again with that wild signature for the food remains. And feature 35 over here in the corner, which is another concentration of fire-cracked rock. That is actually that circular feature that I showed you at the beginning that may be a Native American pre-contact roasting platform, or maybe not, because when you see it, spatially with Cellar 6 and feature 34 and feature 36 and Cellar 5, it really seems to be spatially in line with the other features and basically at the same depth. So there's a lot of questions about that one. We really need to get a radiocarbon date to clarify that. The other really interesting thing were these rocks. So they're here, here, you have this line of large, very flat stones, right? And this is the corner of Cellar 6. These are extending outward from the corner. It sort of suggested that they might be footings for posts or sills or something of that nature for some kind of addition that came off Cellar 6 and didn't have a cellar. It gets more intriguing because in 2021, we excavated feature 34, and what looked like a little rock at the top is actually another large flat stone that was tipped into that pit. And if it had been on the ground surface right there, it would line up in a way where you could get a right angle here of a wall coming out from the cellar and go, excuse me, what did I do? And going that way towards feature 34. So again, hints of possible, earth-fast architecture and possibly early architectural styles here in the colonial period. So, so this is where we ended up in 2019. 2020 was the year that we took off. That was the year that I took over as state archaeologist and started getting more involved in this project. So we're at the situation where we have all these cellars, and we know there's at least 2 occupations at the site. The Gilberts from 1651 to 1663 and the Hollisters until 1711. But we don't know who belongs to which structures, what the chronology of the structures is, and why there are so many cellars at a site that really wasn't occupied that long, 60 or 70 years thereabouts. Okay, so, it's a very complicated site and there's a lot going on here. So, turn to the artifacts to kind of try and sort things out. And I've been kind of going through that in a qualitative way, kind of just assessing what we found. But we really do need to get in there and refine some of the ceramic IDs and other materials to get a better handle on things. Another really useful artifact that we have lots of, apart from ceramics, are pipes. So clay pipes at the Hollister site, you can see here, there's a vast array of styles, shapes, sizes, and also in terms of the stems, different bore sizes. So, pipes are a really datable artifact because the size, shape, and style changes over time. And, there's good documentation of when those changes occur because, there's lots of information about pipe making industries in England and the Netherlands. So, we have lots of pipes ranging from the small pot-bellied pipes of the earlier 17th century, as well as the changes in bowl style that you see down at the bottom reflected as they get straighter and larger over time throughout the 17th century. We also have these red pipes, little pieces of red pipe here, the one here. These are possibly of local origin. They have red clay pipes in places like Virginia and Jamaica, and in both of those places, they're known to have been made locally instead of trying to get them, through trade with Europe. So it's possible that these are locally made pipes. That's a project that Brian was really interested in and he had been working on. We hadn't quite gotten an answer to that, but it's something that, we need to continue going forward with. Most of the other pipes that we have are from English and Dutch manufacturers. But what we don't have in the database, all the material right now is in storage plans this winter are to go and get it and make it more accessible. It's stored off campus at the moment. So we can really start getting into these artifact assemblages and getting a better handle on them. Because, in the inventory, it says pipe bowl. It doesn't really give us enough material unless there's some kind of clear design like the Crusader and Huntress pipe. So we really need to get into that stuff and get a better handle on the typologies that of the bowl shapes that we have and their associations with different features. What we can do from the database, though, is look at the pipe stems. So I'm going to talk about the pipe stem data. I just want to show this map again to reorient everybody with the different features, because I know I've talked about a lot of them. So cellars 5 and 6 are down here at the bottom of the site. You have this main cluster up here with the south, middle, north, and this little cellar off to the side. And then the east cellar is over here. So pipe stems are a really useful artifact. They're used for dating sites all the time. But there's a lot of tricky issues when it comes to dating sites. First of all, you have a mix of English and Dutch sites, and it's unclear if the dating conventions really fit with that mixture. They probably do, because most 17th century sites have that mixture of English and Dutch pipes. So we also have a sample size issue. Formulas have been developed and refined over the years by several people for dating pipes, assemblages of pipes based on bore size. But those formulas work best with large samples. And as you can see from the bottom here, we have quite variable sample sizes from good solid cellar context. I'm trying to take things from below about 50 centimeters to make sure that they're out of the plow zone. So, we get a high of 45 in the middle cellar to a low of 5 in the east cellar. It's not really robust sample sizes. So we're going to take, again, a qualitative approach to looking at the pipe stems. So this figure over here was developed by J.C. Harrington in the 1950s. It looks at bore size based on date ranges. And basically what you're seeing, these numbers on the bottom are measurements. So it's 64ths of an inch measured with drill bits, right? 7/64, 8/64, 9/64, with the idea that the bore size gets narrower over time. The earlier pipes have the biggest bore size. And what Harrington figured out from looking at a large sample is that, in the period between 1620 and 1650, the majority of pipes are 8/64, but you also find 9s and 7s. And in the period between 1650 and 1680, the majority are 7s, but you also find 8s and 6s. Okay, so it kind of works that way. So, again, with small sample sizes, it's hard to say anything definitively, but if you do plot them by bore size, you get kind of interesting patterns. And they really seem to be in line with our sense of things from the material culture that was recovered from these cellars. So we have the south cellar here and that little cellar just west of it. And those seem to have kind of the earliest pipe stems based on bore size, with the majority of 8s and 7s. There's one, I think, 6 from the south cellar. The middle cellar has more 6s, but it still has a lot of 7s and 8s. The north cellar, similar number of 6s, more 7s, etc. So, but we get out to cellars 5 and 6. 6 actually has a lot of 8s, but it has, 5s and, 7s and 6s as well. But this really, it kind of suggests what we might be thinking, that it could be a structure that was built early, but filled late. And again, this is kind of a reach based on this level of data, but it is all kind of fitting together now, and we're really starting to get a better sense of these things from the material. So cellar 5 trends a little bit later, and the east cellar seems to be the latest of them all. So that's kind of what we're going for at this point, just from the sense of the artifacts and the pipes in particular, that, the south and middle cellars probably were filled early, probably the north as well. Cellar 6 and cellar 5 and the east cellar filled towards the later end of the occupation, which may give us a break between the two sets of occupations. We don't know for sure when houses were taken down and when new things were built, but we do know that when the Gilberts leave the site in 1663 and John Hollister Jr. comes out to the site a few years later, he's coming with a new wife to establish a household. And that seems like a pretty good time to, build a new house and bulk up the infrastructure. So that may be a time period where some of this change in structures is occurring. So finally, after that lengthy recap, you're going to get to 2021. So we had big plans when we went out there this summer. We had 3 main goals. One was to investigate the East Cellar a little bit more. That's that cellar just east of the main cluster. One unit had been put in it before, but there wasn't a lot of material. We didn't really have a good sense of it. The other was to go back to that area where they worked in 2019 down in the southern part of the site to investigate features 34 and 35 near Cellar 6. So that's the deer feast kind of pit feature and the roasting platform fire cracked rock feature. And then finally, our plan was to excavate a large area around the South Cellar down to the plow zone, looking for evidence of earth-fast architecture to get a better sense of that structure. And again, to kind of fill in some of the gaps about how those cellars might be connected in that part of the site. So again, to situate you, here's the GPR map, the East Cellars, this one over to the side. We started off with a 3-meter trench similar to the ones that they had dug in the other cellars in other years. And we quickly realized that this cellar is filled with stone and brick rubble. Lots and lots of brick, more than I've seen in the other features. There's very clearly evidence of a brick chimney or hearth in this cellar. It also had a very light artifact density. So this is what it looked like when we were done with the excavation. So you have the area inside the cellar, and up here is the area outside the cellar. This is the profile. You can see the rubble coming in. Here's the cellar floor. There wasn't a ton of material in this site, or in this cellar, excuse me, a lot of lithics over here in this part of the site. Also, some Delftware, lots of redware, relatively, little bit of animal bone. There were some, again, younger artifacts, like more slipware than we had seen in some of the other parts of the site. But in wondering if the lack of material is kind of suggesting that this was filled later. If the south and middle cellars, say, for instance, were open and filled while people were still living on the site and doing things and disposing of their trash, right? They'd be perfect repositories for a lot of stuff that people are using and throwing away. If you're towards the end of the occupation and you're just filling this in to cover it over to revert the land back to farmland, there's not likely to be as much stuff deposited in it, right? So you see more of the actual debris related to the removal of the structure and not a lot of artifacts. So again, this is sort of going with what our sense was, that this structure was probably filled later in the occupation. So the next task that we set for ourselves was to go down to the southern part of the site and investigate feature 34. And this was the large pit feature called the Deer Feast. This is where it's located down there. It's the one circled in red. This is what it looked like in 2019 in plan. You can see the deer bone sticking out of the top. There's that stone that I was talking about that's kind of stuck in down at the side. This is what it looked like in profile. Again, you can see that stone kind of tipped into the feature, but it is large and flat, very similar to the others that we found around Cellar 6. This is what the feature looked like after it was completely excavated. It was a large pit. It was filled with a lot of ash and charcoal. You could really see kind of a gray, ashy layers in the soil. I don't know if this picture is big enough for you to see it, but I think you can even see some of the charcoal flecks and grayish soil in there. Lots of deer bone and thousands of fragments of eggshell. So really great preservation, probably helped along by that ash. There was some, shellfish, a few huge pieces of red earthenware that look like they represent about 2 large vessels. They haven't been mended yet, but I think we'll have a good sense of what kind of vessels they were at the end. A few pieces of kaolin. And there was also this, excuse me again, sorry, this large stone pestle that we found in there. Very characteristic of pre-contact Native American sites, but it's clearly mixed in with this feature. So, it's hard to know if given that roasting platform and this material and some of the other lithics that were found around there, if this part of the historic site is really just, going through a pre-contact occupation, or if this tool was used or possibly even picked up and repurposed in the historic period, because it was well in that feature with the other materials. So, and again, there's that large stone that may be part of an addition to the structure over cellar 6. So the other feature we looked at was feature 35, the possible roasting platform. As I said before, there were no artifacts, just fire cracked rock and charcoal, but its proximity to the historic features and its depth, basically right at the base of the plow zone, is really intriguing because it does sort of seem to have a spatial association with those features. So, we're definitely going to get a radiocarbon data on that this year to help to clarify that. Finally, we tackled the South Cellar, and this is, the most complex thing that we did this summer. It continues to offer a lot of interesting challenges. So this is the picture from 2016 where you can see the post in the corner down in the base of the cellar. We really had a sense, that this structure had earth-fast construction. We really wanted to figure that out. So we tackled it. You can see in the GPR here that there's this little black blob that sticks off the end. And there's another one over here. And those were kind of intriguing. And it turns out that those are most likely features as well. Well, one definitely is. So this is a block from 2021, this year. The South Cellar is actually here underneath the unexcavated part, and this red star marks roughly the location of where that post was down in the cellar. Back in 2016, they had the sense that there may have been stairs coming down here. It looked like there were some boards and some kind of stepped stratigraphy in this area. So that's kind of intriguing, possibly an entrance or steps down into the cellar in this area. So you can see from the aerial photograph here that we did uncover quite a few soil stains. This is that feature that in the location of that little blob I was just talking about that stuck off the cellar in the GPR. This is where our little friend decided to make his burrow, which was really frustrating, but we coped around it. You can see lots of plow scars running through here and a number of other features as well. And I'll talk about some of them really quickly. So just to kind of situate you again, here's the outline of roughly where the South Cellar feature is. We have, and it's hard to see in this, but there are several posts along this edge. You can kind of see some of them. We definitely have a couple like this one that have rocks stuck in them to kind of, support the posts and keep them in place. We also have large posts and small posts, and some of the large posts look to have been reinforced with small posts kind of stuck in next to them. So there's definitely earth-fast construction going on here. There's also a couple of possible posts over on the other side that we haven't gotten to yet. This feature here, feature 38, we did investigate and excavate, so I'll talk about that in a second. We also have feature 68 up here in yellow. That is a fire-cracked rock concentration up there, which is really interesting given its proximity to the cellar and what we saw down in the southern part of the sites with concentrations of fire-cracked rock near cellars 5 and 6. So it's unclear yet whether we're seeing a real pattern or if it's a coincidence. Dating that feature down in the southern part is going to help with that. And then we also have this feature, feature 69, which appears to be a long linear wall feature along the southern part of the cellar. Whether this is a structure wall or some kind of fence is unclear. That's going to have to wait for next year because, we need to close up and get on with things for the winter. But so that's what we were kind of focused on. So feature 38, that thing that sticks off the northern part, turned out to be like a bulkhead or entryway into the South Cellar. So this is what it looked like in profile. We excavated a trench through here because it looked like it was going to collapse because of that burrow. And I wanted to make sure we got the profile before we had any kind of catastrophic collapse. So we excavated out the burrow to get a clean profile. And this is what it looked like. You can see there's a really abrupt start over here on this end. You kind of have like a straight section and then it dips down, kind of slopes in. And over here, it basically goes into the larger body of the South Cellar. There's another kind of straight flat section here. And we were excavating out the disturbed portion. So the rodent basically came down, dipped down here. So the soils were intact up here. As we came across here, you could see these stains coming across with kind of a good vertical line. And then when we excavated it out in going down from the top and plan, we really think that these probably are steps, this and this, because you have this straight line here. We saw it come across the trench, and now we have this very clean straight line here. So that's really intriguing. A couple of steps and then maybe a slope down into the cellar. So it's looking like some kind of bulkhead or entryway. Not a ton of artifacts coming out of there. Ash and charcoal, some bone, a few pieces of really coarse red earthenware, and a couple of pipe fragments, including a fragment of a really nice little pot-bellied kind of pipe bowl that looked kind of early. So, it'll be great to get those back to the lab, float the soil samples, and figure out what's going on in there. But this was a really interesting feature. The other one is feature 68. That's that cluster of fire-cracked rock. So again, to kind of situate you, this is after feature 38 has been completely excavated. So that entranceway came down through here, and the wall to the south cellar is basically running through here. So it's going in there. You can see kind of the edge of feature 38, the part that we didn't excavate, and this unit kind of cuts underneath the edge of this fire-cracked rock here. So it's pretty clear that it's historic and that it's associated with this structure. Given its proximity to the end of the cellar, it's very possible that this could be kind of a rough hearth or hearth base for some kind of end hearth or chimney. If it's a chimney, it certainly wasn't brick. And it may not have been a chimney at all. Maybe just a hole or, really just like a fireplace. It's dug down just a little bit. You can see the subsoil come across here, and it's set a little bit lower. So it may have been a bit recessed if the floor was up above a little bit maybe. But again, we really need to, go farther this way to get a better sense of the shape of it. That's it for the features. There's a couple other things I want to talk about. I know I've been talking for a long time, but there's a few things that I want to talk about because we really started to think about some new directions with the site this summer based on some really intriguing artifacts that we found. And I just want to talk about that a little bit and some of the new historical research that we've done. So in 2021, we found a lot of material, but we found a few things that really stood out. First of all is this chunk of coral that came from the edge of the south cellar. It's definitely, from the Caribbean, so not supposed to be technically here in Connecticut. That's a really intriguing artifact. We found this brass arrow point. Here we did a little mini metal detector survey, and one of our volunteers came up with this. Showed it to Kevin McBride. He said it is certainly an arrow point. It has hit something, it's bent at the end, and it's made in the style of the River Indians and the Wangunk. So that's a really intriguing artifact. We also found this Jesuit or iconographic ring right on top of the south cellar. And, this piece of Dutch Maholico, which we have a couple other pieces that are very similar, but it's just taken all together. These are just a really intriguing bunch of artifacts that made me start thinking about the sites in different ways, the connections to Native people, the connections to, the Dutch in the 17th century, and possibly from the coral, I would suggest the West Indies as well. We had coral at Sylvester Manor, which is a northern provisioning plantation on Shelter Island. And there was quite a bit of it there, and it seems to have been used as ballast on ships coming back from the West Indies in the 17th century. So that is a very clear tie to that part of the world, and incredibly intriguing. So it really made me start to think about the site differently. And first of all, I wanted to dive in and kind of figure out, what was going on with the West Indies trade in this area in the mid 17th century. And that I just started going into the historical record about that, and it kept pulling me farther and farther in with all of these different intriguing threads and ties. And they all seem to relate back in many ways to the Gilbert family and that earlier occupation of the site between 1651 and 1663. So just to kind of situate, I mentioned at the beginning the importance of the Connecticut River. I mean, if you think about it at this time, right, the Connecticut River is the major transportation route. It is the center, right? You have all up and down the river. This is the core of the colony, the Connecticut colony at this time, right? You get Springfield up here, Hartford. There's the location of the Dutch trading post there, Windsor and Wethersfield coming down here to Old Saybrook and the Sound, and, ships basically and transportation. And this is the primary transportation route. It's the primary way to ship goods. It's the primary way to move information. It's the core of everything that's happening. And this site is really located right there on the bank of the Connecticut River, right in the middle of everything that's happening in the 17th century. And I think that that's really, important from its geographic location, but also from a kind of symbolic way, because when you start to get into historic research about the Gilbert family, and the Hollisters are a whole nother interesting topic that clearly need to research more, but just really kind of getting a sense of some of the earlier parts of the occupation from the archaeology, really drawn towards trying to understand this period right now. As I started looking into the Gilberts more, we knew from previous research that had been done. Brian had done some of it. I had done a little bit for a paper that I wrote in the Faunal last year. We knew some things about the Gilbert family. They were a yeoman family from Yardley Parish near modern Birmingham in England. They were in Massachusetts by 1639-40 in the Mount Wollaston Braintree area. So it was a family, the parents were Thomas and Elizabeth, and they had 7 sons and 1 daughter, I believe. We know that because they were given 28 acres of land 6 sons and a daughter, 28 acres of land in Massachusetts. And the rule was basically you got 4 acres per male. So the 3 eldest sons, Thomas, Jonathan, and John, were in Connecticut colony by 1645. Thomas is in Windsor, John and Jonathan are in Hartford, and that's documented. Jonathan gets married in Hartford in 1645, for instance. It's their 4th son, Josiah, that leases the Hollister farm in 1651, but he doesn't do it alone. Later in the 1680s, when he's testifying about a land dispute that Hollister is involved in, he says, I entered upon, in 1651, I entered upon the farm of Lieutenant John Hollister at Niagara as his tenant for about 12 years. I also testify that there was some controversy between Lieutenant Hollister and us, his tenants, my brother and Jonathan and John being concerned with me. And I think that concern is an economic concern. And they're definitely, in this farm together. Even though that John and Jonathan have homes in Hartford, they have an economic tie to this farm. And I think that, this farm very clearly becomes kind of a core of their economic activity, the place from which they start to build their economic security and change their economic station in life, using this farm as kind of the base point for that. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So Thomas and Elizabeth, the parents, and the younger son Obadiah soon joined their sons in Connecticut, and they're both on the Hollister farm until they both pass away in 1659, the 2 parents. And we know that the Gilberts end the lease with Hollister in 1663, and then shortly thereafter, John Hollister Jr. moves on to the property with his family. So here's kind of a family tree for the Gilberts. We know Thomas, John, and Jonathan, the older brothers, are here in Connecticut by 1645. Thomas is in Windsor, John and Jonathan are in Hartford. Josiah and Obadiah end up at Niagara on the Hollister site. Josiah eventually settles in Wethersfield. Obadiah eventually settles in Fairfield. The other 2 siblings, Ezekiel and Sarah, don't seem to ever have anything to do with the site. Both seem to stay in Massachusetts. All of the brothers in Connecticut were married, and those marriages are really important in terms of understanding some of the social and economic ties. And I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute too. So to really understand the Gilbert family, there's a lot going on. This family is really interesting, and they're really involved in everything that's big that's going on in the 1650s and 1660s in Connecticut colony. They're like and by default, the Hollister site is kind of at the nexus of all of these really interesting and important processes that are social, cultural, economic, political. So I just want to talk a little bit about those before I wrap up, because I think it's really important for kind of contextualizing the site and moving forward with the research. So we know that they're farming. They've leased this farm. We have evidence from Thomas Gilbert's probate that, what they're doing on the farm. We've got farm animals and bees and, cheese making equipment and all the typical things that people do on a farm. We've definitely got that going on. The other thing that's really interesting is a connection to the fur trade. They also have a connection to the West Indies trade, to Native people through roles of interpreters and diplomats, to the Dutch, and to the Connecticut witchcraft trials. I mean, seriously, these guys are involved in everything during these decades. So let me just flesh this out a little bit. In 1647, Jonathan Gilbert took over Thomas Stanton's role as Marshal of Connecticut Colony and as interpreter for the colony. He held those positions for a couple of decades afterwards, too. He and John Gilbert served as interpreters to Native people, bringing messages, engaging in negotiations and diplomatic missions to the Narragansett, Pocumtuck, and other groups across the region. In a year in the years where there was a lot going on in terms of trade, but also, tensions and stress and political maneuvering in the years between the Pequot and King Philip's Wars. So this suggests that these two Gilbert brothers, at least, were fluent in the language of local Native people and also had a good understanding of Native economy and society. The Gilberts also seem to have a really strong relation with John Pynchon up in Springfield, and he controls the fur trade in the 1650s. In 1653, Jonathan Gilbert got some land in Hartford on the river and built a warehouse. It quickly became an important part of Pynchon's fur trade operation, with fur stored there for shipment to Boston. In the 1650s, as the decline in animals and tension between the Mohegans and the Native people of the Connecticut River Valley are ramping up and disrupting the fur trade, Pynchon then starts to get involved with trade in the West Indies. Jonathan Gilbert's warehouse becomes a central part of that enterprise as well, with grain, barreled meat, timber, etc., being stored there for shipment to the West Indies. And a lot of this is documented in the Pynchon papers. Jonathan Gilbert's role as marshal also involved him with Connecticut witch trials. But before that, there's another connection. Thomas Gilbert, the other brother, his wife, Lydia Gilbert, dies in 1654. She is convicted of witchcraft in Windsor and probably hung. He very quickly leaves and goes to Springfield, which is interesting, kind of perhaps reflecting that connection to Pynchon, and remarries there. But Jonathan Gilbert as marshal, he may have been involved in that case from a kind of a law enforcement perspective. And he was certainly involved with some of the later cases in the 1660s, including some of the executions. Josiah and Jonathan Gilbert also come up in the last big Connecticut witch trial case, Catherine Harrison's case. This is later after they're gone from the Hollister site, but in 1669. She names both as witnesses to the vandalism of her livestock and property. She's also accused of tainting Josiah Gilbert's wife's black hat and making her sick. At any point following her trial, she ends up getting banished from the colony, not executed, and she goes to Westchester, New York. She also signs over her property in Wethersfield to the Gilbert brothers, which is really intriguing. So that connection to Westchester, New York is another one, and it reflects Gilbert's connections to the Dutch. So in terms of their Dutch connection, in 1654, presumably other members of the family are running the farm at this point. Josiah Gilbert and his younger brother Obadiah left Connecticut for Westchester, also known as Easttown or Oostdorp, which is an English settlement that Thomas Pell tries to establish in what is now the Bronx, right in the middle of New Netherland in 1654. At that time, their parents are living on the farm. The Gilbert brothers appear in documents in New York in New Netherland in 1655 and 1656. So the Dutch are really upset by this attempt to establish a little English settlement here. They try to, they arrest all the men and try to send them back to New England. In 1656, a bunch of them get together and make a petition to stay and say that they'll abide by Dutch rule if they can stay. And Josiah and Obadiah sign that. But they don't stay there for too long. They're back in Connecticut, probably around 1659 or so at the time their parents died. So, we have a lot of really intriguing connections to a lot of things that are going on. And I think, we're starting to see reflections of that in the material culture, which is really cool. So, just to wrap up, I'm sorry this has taken a long time, but there's been a lot to say. So in terms of field work for the future, we're going to keep expanding excavations around the South Cellar, Cellars 5 and 6 to explore the earth-fast architecture, because I think it'll really give us a sense of, what's going on in the early colonial period in terms of, people adapting to the landscape and starting to establish homes and farms here in Connecticut. We don't have a lot of information about this. Very few of these structures have been found in southern New England. They're better understood in the Chesapeake and Maine. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think that this is a great site for learning a lot about that and kind of moving the discipline forward on what that might look like and where these things can be found. We really need to collect larger artifact assemblages from some of the cellars to refine the chronology and better understand the relationships and functions of these structures. And a large part of that is also going to be expanding outward, right? Digging down to the plow zone, looking for features and trying to map it all out and figuring out the relationships between these structures. We're also hoping to do a metal detector survey, a really big, large-scale systematic one to identify concentrations of artifacts outside of the features, because those parts of the site so far have been largely ignored because all of the features have been the focus, the GPR features. So, that might provide information about other aspects of the site that we haven't even encountered yet. In terms of lab work, we really need to get some radiocarbon dates. We're going to date that fire-cracked rock feature and trying to get some dates from the cellars if we can find, material that looks like it might be related to construction. Like initially there was a board found in one of the cellars or a fragment of a board, things like that we can date, and maybe date some materials from the bottoms and some of the associated features to get a better sense of chronology. We need to refine those ceramic IDs, as I was saying earlier, and work on cross-mending so we can get a better sense of the types of vessels that we have, as well as the diversity of ceramic types at the site to help us figure out, not activities and chronology and things like that. Near and dear to my heart, I think more faunal analysis is really required. I got to get through the rest of the assemblages. Where are the domesticated animals? With everything that I've been reading about, being potential involvement in the West Indies trade and the fur trade and things like that, what is the economic strategy here with the domesticated animals on the site? And what is the deal with all the wild species, right? People hunted in this time period for sure, they definitely did, but there's almost no domesticated animals so far, and that's really intriguing. Maybe they're using those animals as food sources to ship someplace else, and so more work is really going to be required to figure that out based on skeletal part representation and things like that. Again, going back to those red clay pipes, trying to figure out if they're local, and also going forward and before we really start to delve into the cellars on a larger scale or start a metal detector survey, we really need to work out a conservation strategy for some of the materials that are coming out of here. The preservation is great. A lot of the materials seem really stable. But once we get into materials like iron, the deterioration is clear, and I don't really want to pull a lot more of those out of the ground until we have a conservation strategy in place. Finally, for future directions in historical research, really kind of dig into the documents and find out more about the Gilbert family's activities and connections in the colonial records, about the relationships with indigenous people, the fur trade, West Indies trade, Dutch connections. There's so much going on there, and it's really fascinating to figure out how the site fits into all this stuff that they're doing. And of course, we also need additional research on the Hollister family and their activities in the later part of the occupation. So, just to wrap up, I want to say thank you to everybody. So many people have been involved in this project for so many years. To Brian, of course, for getting it all started and laying the groundwork and, for his enthusiasm and for getting everybody involved in this project and to understand how important and significant the site is. To Mark Packard and Kathy Ogden, who own the property and let us come out there and make a mess of their pasture. To FOSA, especially Scott Brady, Joan Hill, Dick Hughes, Ed Goodrich, and Lee West, who've been out there all fall with me through all kinds of different weather, trying to finish up some of this work. To Nick Bellantoni, for 2019 and going out there and leading the investigations and keeping the project going. To Peter Leach for help with the GPR and having discussions with me about it going forward. And helping me understand some of the things that they found, and to all the volunteers, students, and researchers that have been out at the site, and also to the Historical Society of Glastonbury for their support and for their interest in the project. So thank you very much.
Okay. So I think we have a couple of questions that have come in during the talk. If you want to take a quick drink. There's one in the Q&A, and then there's one in the chat. Anyone else who has questions, please either ask them in the chat or Q&A feature. Again, you can do the raise your hand feature as well, and I can promote you to a panelist so you can ask it in person. So can you see the questions, Sarah?
I see one. Are there extant colonial gravestones from the second half of the 1600s and first quarter of the 1700s for Hollister and Gilberts? Yes, there are some. Definitely, I think the gravestones of most of the Gilbert brothers are around in Wethersfield and Hartford. I'm not sure about Fairfield and Springfield. And there's definitely some for Hollisters as well.
And then there's one in the Q&A too.
When looking at the animal and fish bones, the unidentified fish was probably shad. That was very important. Yeah, it almost certainly was. So, I am not a fish expert. I really need to work on figuring out what some of the fish are. We identified a few others since I did that work in 2019, such as catfish, but really need to get a better handle on the fish, and fish are hard. And I need to find a place where there's, better comparative collections, or possibly even, reach out to somebody who's an expert on fish, because they're clearly a huge part of the diet here at the site, and we just have this remarkable preservation, and it would be a shame not to get all the information out of that.
I had a question. Mm-hmm. The board that was found a couple of years ago, how thick is it? And could you do dendrochronology on it instead of just radiocarbon dating? Could you do both, you think?
I don't think so. It's pretty fragmented at this point.
Okay.
But I think, it's possible that could go back into that cellar and find more, mm-hmm. and kind of start fresh, or think, if you're going in there specifically with the goal of getting something like that, the strategy might be a little bit different. So
right. It could really help refine those chronologies though.
Yeah.
Other questions? Okay, so John has raised his hand. I'm going to try to allow you to talk. There you go, John. You just now need to unmute yourself. John Luby, I think you can unmute yourself. I don't think that I can do it yourself. I don't think that I can do it.
I got it.
Got it, great.
All right. Hi, Sarah. I live down the street from the site in a house that dates from the early 1700s on the banks of the Roaring Brook. And my question is, do you know the sizes of the foundations that you've found at the site? And are any of them close to the size of our original house foundation, which is 20 feet by 25 feet?
I don't have the measurements off the top of my head, but that sounds pretty consistent with the sizes of some of them. If you shoot me an email, I can try and calculate that for you from some of the maps and the GPR images that we have.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And then some more came in on the Q&A feature here too.
How far apart are the cellars? How loud do you think the structure might have been? So that's an interesting question. There's about 20 meters between the south cellar and cellar 5, down in the southern part of the site. So those seem to be spatially distinct areas. It's about 90 feet between the south cellar and the north cellar. So that would be a very long house if that's what it is. But it's possible. Structures 70 feet or so have been documented before. It's possible. I just think that we don't really have a sense right now of how those structures were related. I mean, it's possible that the south cellar wasn't connected to the north cellar. It might have been just connected with that little cellar that's to the west of it. It's going to take a long time and a lot of digging, I think, to hammer some of that out and try to understand those associations and relationships. And it might be a few years before we can get there. But, long, narrow structures are not outside of the realm of possibility for sure. And I think, it's a situation where you might just continue to add on to a house as needed, because we see a lot of colonial houses, late 17th, early 18th century, where you have portions of it that are over cellars and additions and sections that are earth fast. So people, are just adding to these things as necessary. Scott Brady asked, can you talk a little bit about how we're currently re-examining the ceramic assemblages and our new interpretations of some of the original finds? Yeah, so, I think when this project started, when the inventorying started, with grad students and Brian, and everybody was really trying to get a handle on the 17th century as a period. There's not a lot of correlates for a site like this locally. Not a lot of people have dug sites like this. So, getting a sense of the possibilities for material culture is part of, your ability to identify that stuff and inventory it properly. So, I think some of the early stuff was probably misidentified or identified super conservatively. I think that, some of the red earthenwares that we have, for example, might be red borderware. And, there's a possibility that we could have some Dutch coarse earthenwares in there as well. Just going through some of the earlier materials, a couple of weeks ago, we found some fragments that hadn't really been identified specifically, but were very clearly North Devon gravel tempered ware. And that's big sections. It was kind of on that second to last slide with the lab work, those big rim sherds of some kind of big jar, big storage jar. So if we can go back through the ceramics, and the Delft too, and the Maholica and stuff, getting a sense of, where those are from and what the patterns are, and when those were manufactured and when they might date to, can really help us to refine the chronologies. So, we really need to get to places where they have good collections that are contemporaneous with the site, because it's really hard to do this stuff from books and online. You got to see some of it and talk to people who are, experts and really understand the material culture from this period. But we're working to get up to speed on that. And I think that, there's a lot of information that we already have. We just need to go back and kind of tease some of it out and build on what was done before. And then I think we'll be in a much better place to kind of understand the chronology of the site.
And then there was a comment from Lucy. I don't know if you can see it or not in the chat feature.
Oh, hold on. Oh yeah, Renee Petrozelli has expertise in fishbone analysis. That's a really good point. Thank you, Lucy. I did not think about that, but thinking back now, she definitely did a fishbone project when we were in grad school. I will reach out to her and see if she has time to look at some of that stuff. That's a fantastic suggestion. I appreciate it.
Okay, so are there other questions coming in? I had another one. I know you didn't talk about the gun flints today, but you mentioned, I don't know, last week or so that you had a bifacial one. Do you have any unifacial gun flints too that you know of? Has there been an inventory of the bifacial and or unifacial gun flints at the site?
I don't think so. They're just recorded in the inventory as gun flints. So that's another thing. Someone would have to go back through and kind of look at them more closely. There's a huge, not huge number, but there's quite a few of them from across the site. We have English flint and then the possible kind of honey colored French flint as well. That would be a great project for someone, because I know that there's interesting questions about the ways that gun flints are knapped and made, and maybe who was making them and what that means in terms of the cultural affiliation of those people. So that could be a really good project for someone if they're interested.
Then there was another question in the Q&A feature.
Any ideas as to where the brick was manufactured? No, but I will say that, the most brick that I've seen out there so far was this year from the East Cellar, where we had lots of it. And some of it was like really, we had a couple of different styles, I think. Some were far more like uniform, typical brick sizes, kind of neater, and others were kind of big and chunky and lumpy. So I would guess that a fair amount of it's probably being manufactured locally, but I don't know, exactly where. I imagine that by, the end of the 17th century, people are certainly making brick locally. So I'm sure some of it came from, the surrounding area.
And then there's another question in the Q&A feature.
Oh, sorry. No. Is there any evidence of slave occupation in the structure? No, there isn't. And I will say that in terms of the historic records, there's no indication that Gilberts or Hollisters in this time period had captive Africans. Some members of those families, at least the Gilberts I know, did in later periods. In many ways, there aren't a lot of enslaved Africans in Connecticut before the end of the 17th century, as West Indies trade really ramps up, and there's a few other reasons for that. But as of right now, there's no clear evidence that African slaves were on this site.
So are there any other questions? Anybody else want to raise their hand and ask one in person, or ask one in the Q&A or chat feature? We'll give everyone another little bit to ask a question. I just want to mention that this is the final lecture in the fall series for the ASC and FOSA joint lecture series. There is not currently one planned for the winter, but we will be having a meeting at some point soon to discuss that possibility. Normally, in pre-pandemic years, the ASC would meet in the spring and the fall, and we are hopeful that we will be able to meet in person this coming spring for a lecture series where we can have in-person lectures. But I think that we can all agree that these virtual lecture series have been very good, just like this one today. So ASC and FOSA are planning to continue these in the future, whether we meet in person or not in the spring. Let's see, there's another, just a congratulations that this was a great presentation. I would agree with that. It was a very interesting presentation. If there are no other questions, let's see. So yes, as I said, there will be more virtual lectures coming in the future. And will the recording be posted? Yes, all of the recordings for the joint FOSA and ASC lecture series are posted on the ASC website. They may be posted on the FOSA website too, I'm not sure about that. But on the ctarchaeology.org website, you can find this lecture. You will find this lecture soon. And all of our previous lecture series are posted there as well, which is probably something I should mention at the beginning of each of these. So if there are no other questions or comments, please join me in thanking Dr. Sportman for this fascinating talk. And we hope to see you all again, possibly in the winter or in the spring in person. So thanks.
Thanks, everybody.